I want to welcome everybody to our talk on Sunday morning. A couple weeks ago, I interviewed a mutual friend, Dr. Carl Hart, who just wrote the book Drug Use for Grown-Ups, in which he said, well, he says a number of things, most of which are compatible with what we say. And I just want to say up front, we're on his side. And we're going to discuss an interview that he had recently. And I'm sure that it's not the first time an interview's been like this for him. And it's certainly not going to be the last, where he was sort of ganged up on for his point of view, which is mainly that, well, to say it in a few words, like he would say it, drugs aren't the problem. So anything that people think that is a problem by virtue of drugs, he says, nope, think again. There's something deeper going on. Drugs aren't the problem. Most people can take drugs and they're okay. To the extent that people are taking drugs and it's killing them or hurting them, it has to do with our policies around drugs and the mythology that drugs are bad. So
and he would also say, negative social conditions,
right,
coming out of the Miami ghetto, and he would have one little other category where they have some kind of psychological problem. I've heard him throw that in as a residual.
True, and a myriad other things. Like he does talk about social depravity, and he talks about the possibility of psychological issues. He's looking at it from a strictly research lens where he has to talk to other researchers about if he has the findings that, well, drugs aren't the problem. For whatever strange reason, people put the onus on him to prove a negative. Like people are saying drugs are the problem. And he says, all right, let me test that. And then he says, no, it looks like they're not. I said, well, prove it. And so for whatever reason, he takes on that challenge. And I think that might be part of what could be bogging him down in certain interviews, like the one I'm about to mention. So he was on a show called The Breakfast Club to talk about his new book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups. The Breakfast Club is actually a radio station, one of the few legit radio stations left, hosted by a man named Charlemagne. He calls himself Charlemagne the God, DJ Envy, and Angela Yee. He's Carl goes on these shows, and especially on mainstream media, he's used to just blowing people's minds. He'll either get into a heated debate, and those are things like Bill O'Reilly, who I know you know, and where he goes on and he expects the stupid debate, so he kind of has his talking points. Or he talks to people who he knows are going to be sympathetic with him. Like I think he believed that this crowd was going to be, where he has a more nurturing kind of an attitude, where people might be ignorant, and he says, all right, I think this might be a little bit of ignorance on your part, but certainly not malice. So let me meet you where you are and see if I can walk you through this. And then they say, oh my God, this is so crazy. Drugs aren't the problem. That's not exactly what happened here.
You mentioned he was on a podcast with a guy who liked him a lot, who also kind of had a kickback reaction. Do you remember that one as well? A famous national podcast. Who's the most famous guy? He likes Carl.
Joe Rogan.
Right.
Rogan. Yeah, that's true. Rogan agreed with pretty much everything, and at least he listened to him. To the things that he disagreed with, or some mythology that Rogan kind of spouted, Carl would push back and say, whoa, let's talk about this. And Rogan would say, all right, well, tell me what. And so maybe he didn't get through to him, but at least he had the platform and time to listen.
It wasn't hostile.
Right, exactly. So he's used to just saying stuff like, well, let's back up and look at the evidence. And he'll say, please remember, I'm the one doing the research here. Or he'll make simple analogies, because of their already simplistic kinds of ideas. And he talks about things like drugs really are doing drugs is no different than any other sort of activities that people can make cost benefit decisions about. And people tend to handle them just fine as long as they have the means and resources, education, all of the things we talk about. But as you say, this wasn't the kind of interview that he was expecting, and he got stuck. The hosts, and particularly Charlemagne and DJ Envy, actually, you probably noticed that the other host, the woman, Angela, she at least wanted to hear him. But they wanted him in the seat so that they could express their frustration about how naive this problem is. They had that like knee-jerk reaction that we're used to people having when you say, drugs aren't terrible. They say, oh, wait a minute, my brother, my mother, So Hart decides to take his nurturing, almost harm reduction approach to ignorance. And the mistake he made is that he assumed that they wanted to learn from him. I really don't think they did. They wanted to be right. So he sat down, he got to their level to provide simple analogies and explanations. But because he simplified things, they jumped on that. You know, he was simplifying things so that he could meet them where they were and their understanding of what he was talking about. But then they jumped on his simple explanations and treated him like his whole argument was just overly simplistic. And this kind of spiraled out of control. He kept meeting them at sort of a lower level tier of thinking than he was, and they would argue with this strange idea about what he was saying. So I just want to show one clip. It might sound confusing me saying it. This is just one of 1,000 examples, and it was almost painful to watch.
Or heroin is the evil thing to engage in.
Because those things hurt people, including the person using them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, great question. So
I didn't ask a question, but
He made a statement.
Yeah.
well, I was trying to save you, right? Because on the one hand, you should know that heroin is a medication that is approved for treatment. Heroin and morphine are essentially the same drug. The Bayer Aspirin Company, for example, in 1874, just attached two acetyl groups to morphine to make heroin. But the bottom line is that they're the same drug because the acetyl groups don't have any biological effects.
Didn't Bayer used to be called heroin?
No.
Something like that?
No.
I saw something about that.
No. But the point is that heroin is a perfectly good pain reliever. It also induces euphoria and a wide range of effects that we desire, like pleasure. So when you say that it doesn't harm you, certainly it can harm you. If people overdo it and they don't know what they're doing, yeah, they certainly can be harmed. Just like when you drive a car.
But is it addictive though? Is heroin addictive?
Is heroin addictive? Certainly can be addictive. You drink alcohol?
Not really.
Well, people drink alcohol. Alcohol is addictive. Sugar, all of these sorts of things can be addictive. In my book, I'm trying to help people to understand what makes things addictive, not the substance itself, because as much as 75% of the people who use heroin are not addicted. They don't have any problem.
What you said? What percentage? I'm sorry.
As much as 75%. So when you see this, you say, all right, if most of the people who use that drug, or any other drug for that matter, are not addicted, then you have to look beyond the drug itself.
Something that you and I are going to get on about a little bit later, but one thing he does there is he asked him, isn't heroin addictive? And I don't think that Carl actually would say something is or isn't addictive. It's not really how he thinks about it, but he knows he has to speak that language. So he sort of goes down to talk about what is or isn't addictive. Obviously, it's like nothing's really addictive. It's just people can become addicted to something given their circumstances. We'll talk about
I don't think he would go as far as we would go in that direction. Maybe I'm wrong. The woman threw in sugar and Carl went along with that.
Yeah.
But I believe in my experience with Carl, and I think we had a little conflict around that on the Addiction Theory Network. He doesn't have a theory of addiction. He doesn't want to expand the idea of addiction. When he says, sure, heroin can be addictive, but do you drink alcohol? You and I would say, well, there's no list of addictive things and non-addictive things. There's things that provide people with the kind of emotional resonance, a reliability that they seek, a predictability. And I would say sugar's more pleasurable than heroin, because heroin is a depressant drug. And it operates primarily through creating an absence of pain. So we tend to focus on the experience. We would say people become addicted to experiences. Carl wouldn't say that. He might not say, I guess I don't know when he says, well, heroin is addictive and so is alcohol. Would you say that Carl doesn't have a list of addictive drugs?
I would say he doesn't. Reading his book, whatever his beliefs were, and you can sort of see them change and mature over the years. I'm sure you know. But in his book, that's sort of what you said is what he was saying. Like there isn't You can't list all the things that are and aren't addictive. You can just talk about why somebody runs into problems with them and why they don't. So I do think he believes that now. But he's willing to go and say, he's willing to think, okay, you're saying addictive, and I know what you mean by that, so let's just have that conversation. I don't think he's very willing to, and I don't know if he really knows how he would go about pulling back and saying, well, let's talk about this word addictive for a minute. It's just not something he really discusses. He sort of understands the landscape, sees it, is familiar with it the same way that we are. I think believes the same things that we do about you can't have a list of things that are, and then you have another list of things that aren't addictive. But he just doesn't talk. It's just not something he has language for or discusses very much. He tries to meet people where they are in that regard, and I don't thinks much about it.
He doesn't have a theory of addiction. He doesn't say, well, people get addicted to this experience because it serves a function that has these kinds of kickbacks. He doesn't have an elaborated theory, but I basically we're in the same space.
That's exactly where I'm going with it. Unfortunately, I think we both think that to really engage in an interview like this and get to a place where he's making sense to these interviewers, he would have to come prepared with a larger package than he comes prepared with. Not just drugs aren't the problem, so that he can anticipate people are going to bring up, stories about their kids, their aunts and uncles who did have problems with drugs. He needs a broader analysis, which has to include not just people who use drugs with no problems, but what happens to the people who run into problems. Why do they run into problems? And the fact that they tend to get better over time. How do they?
You said the Rogan guy brought up, well, I have a friend who's a heroin addict. Is that true? You recall that?
No, yeah, it wasn't a heroin addict. He was telling a story about his friend. Rogan was saying, well, I have a friend who was bit another guy's ear off because he was on PCP.
Oh, Carl hates those stories the worst.
So he dealt with it he didn't want to ruin the moment. So he laughed at him and said, well, guess you got to get better friends. Or no, it's exactly
his best stories, which are true. Yeah. There's a whole mythology about people who take animal tranquilizers and PCP and meth, and they do something totally crazy. And I remember when Carl first started doing media, he would or if he was on a sympathetic show like Reason, he'd go, "Oh, for God's sake!" They talk about cutting off animals' heads. So that's one set. That set of bullshit myths is the one he's most direct on confronting. But I got kicked off the Addiction Theory Network because I can't go into all of it, but Carl got down on the group because they were too focused on addiction. And one of the other members, Mark Lewis, wrote me saying, where's Carl going with all this? He's really going off the deep end. And I was so amused by the whole thing that I put the interchange on Facebook. And so my good friends who run that network, Nick Heather and Derek Heim, nobody's been better to me than them, threw me off. And then I got an email from Carl and I was afraid to open it. I never opened it for like 6 months.
You did finally open it?
No, I never opened it. He called me.
Oh.
And he called me and he gave me, or he emailed me and said, call me. And I called him and he was hurt, that I had, I don't know, revealed that, or that that I was amused by the conflict. But at that time, he was put, a couple of years ago now, 2017, 4, he was putting it down as an academic preoccupation that people would care what addiction is. But I think where we're coming is when he comes into that room and he says, people take heroin, they don't become addicted.
Yep.
And then somebody says, well, my mother became addicted to her. What about that guy on television? And they'll say, well, that guy on television, they made that up,
Yep.
But he doesn't have something to slot in to say
exactly. He can't just play whack-a-mole with all the dumb stories, because those stories are meaningful to those people. They believe them for maybe dumb reasons, but they believe them and it's salient to them, and they get a sensory cue to feel some way or some about those stories. And so just saying, well, your story is dumb, now let me talk about the data. Carol Tavers would tell us that no one's going to change their mind that way. So exactly what you're saying, he'll need to not just dismiss those claims or just laugh them off, or just if someone says, well, aren't things addictive, you can't just go into those conversations saying, well, yeah, it's addictive, but also other things are. There's a way that we think that we've seen, that we understand, that he could sort of lay out a broad theory and help people understand it, lay out a framework so that when people make those comments, he can then say, actually, that's not compatible at all. That language isn't even compatible at all with the thing that I'm talking about. And I think that
we lay out the criteria for addiction: the absorbing experience that gives you certain needs, but it has a negative kickback. And then one thing you could do, the ICD-11 officially declares gaming addictive. So you could say, is gaming addictive to those people? Carl doesn't throw back to them. And you could say, do you think gaming is addictive? And they would say, well, yeah, but not like heroin. And then Chris, you're in some kind of crazy argument. What you mean? There's some of the, DSM, American Psychiatric Manual, says it only uses the word addiction to apply to gambling, not gaming. So you say, well, is gaming addictive? And then you can say, well, why is it addictive? I gave you my criteria for why gaming can be addictive. It's very absorbing. A person loses, it provides them a feeling of reassurance and predictability. They lose track of the rest of their lives. That becomes more depreciated, and then they're more reliant on it. That's my definition of addiction. Does that help you deal with gaming? And so, they probably would agree that gaming was addictive. Most people kind of have that experience. I mean, Carl's, when he talks about science, he'll say, well, aspirin or heroin is just, an attachment to, this basic drug. And he'll talk about chemical structure. He talks about meth being the same chemical structure as Adderall. So he has technical knowledge that other people don't have. And so he announces these things, and they're true. But it has no resonance with their experience. And the method that I use in those situations, I think you've seen me, is, to do recovery. I always use the example of smoking. I go, to a room of people, what's the most addictive drug? And they say smoking. And then I say, does anybody in this room quit smoking? And if you're in a recovering conference, if there's 500 people, 300 of them, 400 have quit smoking. And then I go, how did you quit smoking? Did you join a recovery group, or did you use a chemical, even a drug? And sometimes nobody raises their hands. So I say, so you quit the toughest addiction without any sort of chemical aid or a recovery group. How's that possible? And then on the other hand, around heroin, of course, what was that, Dreamland? Is that the name of the book where the guy, everybody knows that painkillers.
Sam Quinones.
Everybody knows that they're opioids, because that's what's mainly in the news.
Yeah.
And then, I do this routine where I say to the room, well, has anybody ever taken an opioid painkiller? Everybody raises their hand. And I say, well, did you become addicted? And nobody in the room has become addicted. I say, well, if they're so addictive, how's that possible?
People can think of that. Well, that's the perfect way to do it. You get people to begin by telling you what their experience and their beliefs are, and then contradict their beliefs themselves, but you don't have to do anything. I think people think about it, I want to say this before I lose the thought, like, well, most people get coronavirus and don't die from it, but still enough people get it and die from it. It's almost like everyone's walking around thinking, well, this is just chance. That's what Carl's, I think, is missing from this discussion, is that it comes across as though he's saying, well, 75% of people are fine. And so there's this space where they say, well, what about those 25%? Just screw them all. Those people, and he doesn't have, of course, he talks sensibly about what it means that people become addicted or have problems with drugs or get hurt from drugs. Poison drug supply causes death. That has to do with policy. People become dependent on drugs or believe that they're dependent on drugs as a sole source of satisfaction in their lives for reasons that really have nothing to do with the drug. It's just all the experience. But as you say, he's not he doesn't have a format for discussing that. Whereas you can say, well, give me any drug. Well, whatever you're worried about, tell me what you think is the worst case, and we can do this exercise for all of them. And that's what he doesn't have. He doesn't have this general way to be able to walk people through on their own what his theory is and then come to terms with it on their own.
Would you call Carl a psychologist?
No, I mean, no, he's not. And I don't think he would like to call himself one either.
He was head of the Department of Psychology.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so.
So he's a
he's not a clinical psychologist, I guess, but
he's a neuroscientist.
Right.
And he has psychological explanations. He'll say, well, people who are troubled are more likely to get into a bad, but he doesn't deal in the psychological realm. And so he's got the difficulty, if you're a neuroscientist, yet Mark Lewis does a little bit better with that. He sort of says, well, people's brains develop. So he has some common ways of talking about neuroscience. If you're going to talk about the effects of drugs based on laboratory research, well, they're going to have to take your word for it. And,
right.
It's going to be hard to relate.
Right.
Except Carl does have, some of the experiments, he does neuroscience things, but he does psychology things. His most famous thing of that type was there's a whole body of research where they take addicted people and they say, well, what would it take to get them not to be addicted? That was mainly done with alcohol. There's a group called the City Hospital Group of Baltimore, which I spoke to. You can't do this research anymore. It's for reasons that'll be obvious when I describe it. They'll take street alcoholics, guys who hang out in the street drinking from bottles, and they'll say, we'll give you, $10 a day if you do an experiment. They bring them into a place where they can reside. And they say, you can drink as much as you want in this little isolated cubicle, or there's a, television room with the TV, nice warm sofas. Other guys are hanging out there and snacks, but you can't drink there. And so they drink less because they want to spend some time. So if you have a model of alcoholism, well, it's genetic. As soon as you taste the alcohol, you're out of control. That's not the way life works.
Yeah.
They're taking alcohol for a reason, but then if you give them some other reasons, well, they'll take less alcohol.
This is an aside. My wife has this. I think about this all the time. She's a supervisor at a clinical supervisor, and people spin their wheels all the time. They have all these theories. They've read these textbooks. They have their CEUs or whatever that they're fresh on their mind. And she notices, sometimes people just can't get their mind back on practical, real life situations. So she asked a couple simple questions, and one of them is, all right, explain the problem a little bit. And then they do. And then she'll say two things. What would make it better? And what do you think would make it worse? And that somehow puts people right in the moment and starts thinking more.
She learned that from you. That's a little bit of your approach, isn't it?
No, I learned it from her.
Good
no,
enough.
she's had some brilliant tricks up her sleeve. She's sneaky.
But
sorry for interrupting.
They're not trying to make the alcohol. Well, the Boston City Hospital guys, they can't do that research anymore. Mm-hmm. But there's a practical version of that research, which is called wet housing, which means guys can come in off the street and live there and drink, and then they have a room. And you can drink sort of as much as you want, but while they're in a room and they don't have to worry about being cold on the street, if you can't walk around with a bottle of booze on the street, somebody will take it or hit you over the head. You can store it. They actually start dropping their drink. They're still what we would call alcoholics, but in that comfortable setting, they drink less. They don't become social drinkers, but they become more relaxed and comfortable. And, hopefully they're treated with respect. so that's an example where eliminating the concept of loss of control and saying that the environment affects even the worst street type drinkers. You can apply that and they'll stop being the worst street side drinkers. That's a real harm reduction approach. The Boston City Hospital guys were like scientists. Carl's version of that research is, he would advertise for experienced meth. It's hard to get real drug addicts into labs. It's hard to find real drug addicts in New York City. So he gets experienced meth users into the lab and he says, well, I'll give you $5 or $10 if you don't take meth today. And they go, okay, all right. And guys have used that clinically. There's a group at the University of Vermont. They paid people to be sober. They paid people to show up for clean urines. So, that's, then the question becomes, well, are you going to pay them $10 or $100 a day for the rest of their lives? So it's not a totally practical thing, but it has a scientific implication. Well, if you think they're out of control, they're not out of control. They're just balancing their options, and their options are different than yours and mine. So, and Carl did that research. So he'll refer to that, but he doesn't refer to that kind of work. He doesn't have an elaborated model like that. Well, people are just balancing out their options, which he's doing that research. And for some people in some situations with a certain outlook, taking meth or heroin or alcohol, that's their best deal. That's the way they're going to go. And unless you can change the rewards in their life by giving them, you can give money. In the life process program, we would say, well, we're going to try and help them develop skills that will allow them to get other rewards to outweigh the rewards of the whatever. In our case, gambling or shopping or sex or food, but we're going to try and help them balance that scale in a different way. So he starts out with drugs, and he knows drugs don't do what people say they do.
Can I, before you go, oh, no, go ahead.
Go on, keep going.
Before you go on any further, I just want to make clear, I want to review what I said so far in a couple words. I watched this interview that first of all, I read his book, Drug Use for Grownups. Excellent book.
And you interviewed him.
And I interviewed him. And it was the book was an outstanding proof and thesis about what real problems really are. And I agree with him wholeheartedly about it. And I think you do too. He was on this interview and I was just watching the extent to which people can be ignorant and knowingly and sort of wanting to be ignorant almost. It was painful to watch this whole interview. We enjoy him and the work that he's doing and the message that he's putting out, including I do drugs. I'm all right. I do drugs responsibly. I'm an adult. I can think about it. And he even says things like, I do chemically very pure drugs so that that's part of the way that I weigh the risk and the reward, and I think that everyone should be.
Well, he mentioned overdose, and he says, well, overdose, which we know is a mixture of drugs. Mm. And so I'm able to use drugs safely because I'm able to get better heroin. If you're going to start getting stuff off the street, that's the danger.
That he's saying I can get something that's chemically pure. And the argument to him is, well, isn't that nice? You can get something that's chemically pure. What about these other people? And really, he should be saying, well, no, yeah, what about those other people is what I'm saying. People should be able to access what I'm accessing, and they're not able to because we have this backwards sort of idea that drugs are horrible. Let's make sure that we wipe them out of existence, even though we know that's not possible. And now what we have is just completely unsafe.
But he doesn't. He get into drug. He doesn't get into heroin maintenance and drug consumption sites, does he?
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he does.
Okay.
I mean, he went the depth. I was.
So that's a policy angle.
Yeah.
I get pure drugs, but they can make them for other people too. He
even has a chapter, which I was surprised to see in the book, called Addiction is not a brain disease, where he does talk about the reasons why it's important that we understand that there's not something pathological that's caused by drugs, or that's triggered by drugs, or that's genetic and, jump started by drugs to a vulnerable genetic population or something like that. But he doesn't, as you're mentioning right now, get into an addiction theory really. And I think maybe part of that for him and for others is, well, it's not my bailiwick, it's not my area specialty. I don't want to argue. This is a worthless argument about what addiction is or doesn't exist or something like that. I just want to get into policy and saving lives. And you will argue, actually, it's incredibly important to have a sensible theory about what addiction is, an understanding of what it is, and way to talk about it.
And you're saying that would help him get on television shows and podcasts. In a way, his first book was called High Price. Yeah. Which gets into that research I was describing. In a way, it implies the meth research where, if you give people money, they'll stop taking meth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that much money. But he had the same problem, because that book there's Carl Hart's an appealing guy. He's a good looking guy. He's got that great dreadlocks. He's athletic, and he looks good. He really looked good out there in that show. That was a nice suit he had on. I really admired that. He's obviously a brilliant man, and obviously people are, high prices. How did the guy get to compose himself this way? Being raised somewhere in Miami,
right. There's
with
the
a
personal
single mother.
experience.
And so that was half his book. Even then, that was half his book. And then the other half of his book is, I figured out it wasn't drugs. I figured out it wasn't drugs because I went back to Miami, and after the crack epidemic of the 80s, the people were in the same situation. So they weren't taking crack, big deal. And this is an extension of that. And I figured it out because he took some recreational drugs younger, but later in life, now he's taken some heroin and cocaine. He talks about taking some speed in the book. And when even based on that book, people couldn't deal comfortably with those two parts. I saw him interviewed by a man named Chris Hayes on MSNBC.
Oh, yeah. Yep, Chris Hayes.
People love him. They say they want to hear his story. And then when he switched into the story, that the problem he has in this show, it goes beyond, and the Rogan show, and he's fighting a ton of myths. It's not that, they're reacting to him. They're reacting, well, they believe these things. Not he's here to tell them everything you believe. Another thing he says, everything you believe about drugs is wrong. Something I've said a lot as well. I would see Carl speak. The first time I saw him speak, he was being interviewed by a man I know, a friend of mine, John Tierney. Maya was there. When I came in, Maya said, Carl, Stanton's here. We had never met. And Carl was very warm. And I said, how's Carl know me? Although Ethan had said, well, Carl thinks the same way about drugs as you. And he said, at that time, he said, well, 80 to 90% of people who take drugs have no problems with it. He said, well, heroin withdrawal isn't what they make it out to be. It's like a bad cold. People get over it all the time. And afterwards, because a guy came up to me because he had seen, because Carl began, but every time I've seen Carl speak, he begins by saying, well, Stanton Peele's in the audience. Much of what I say, most of what I say varies. I, heard originally from him. He said that in his interview with you. And then the guy comes up to me and said, what he said about drugs and heroin isn't true, is it? And I said, well, you got the wrong message. You're asking the wrong guy.
Yeah, right.
And then Carl afterwards came up to me and said, well, how do you deal with all this? And my joke is Carl's looking to me as a role model when he's a professor of psychiatry and psychology at Columbia. So, but what he's talking about is he's always encountered a lot. As soon as he's espoused the idea that the drugs are not the problem, everything you believe about drugs is wrong, he's in a conflict situation. He's used to that.
So before today, you said, when I told you I wanted to talk about this, you said, the same things that I am are landing in the same place. And you said there's basically 5 ways to know what the reality of drug use is. In other words, that most use is normal and most people recover naturally. You already talked about, well, Carl has personal experience growing up in Miami, seeing people use drugs around him, figuring out the drugs aren't the problem. He has done extensive lab research, and you talked about similarly in Baltimore City Hospital and Johns Hopkins. Can you
So,
talk
and the third kind is he's now using personal experience.
right?
Well, I've taken heroin. Look at me, I'm a regular guy.
Right.
And so you're in a different ballpark when you're going to rely on that. People are going to say, well, what about my aunt? You know,
Exactly.
she became a heroin.
Right.
And you didn't include this in the clip, but along the way, Charlemagne said to him, are you going to show that piece or?
Yes. Let's do it right now.
Watching your body language and I see you shaking, I'm like, okay, is he going through a withdrawal or is he upset about
Give me a
something?
break, man.
I'm being honest.
Come on. You know,
You're upset, clearly.
yeah, you know, it's like, first of all, I have too much respect for you. Too much respect for you and too much respect for you not to come here and be correct. You know, obviously I am upset about what has been said about me because, you know, I have children, I have a family, I have all of these sorts of things.
Would you want your children to indulge in drug use? Because, you know, growing up, I see you from Miami, you from a poverty-stricken area. You've sold drugs, you used drugs as a kid.
I'm gonna let it play.
But you know,
This is
the
good.
thing that
This
you-
is interesting.
Okay, the thing you're talking about comes a little bit
especially
after this.
drug, don't use cigarettes. It's a gateway to stronger drugs. Would you advise your kids to use drugs and tell your kids about using drugs?
It's like saying, would you advise your kids to have sex, right?
Why is sex always the correlation?
Because everybody, I hope, has had sex.
But if
so
my
I'm
kids are
trying
getting
to.
married,
Well, I'll tell you.
but if my kids are getting married, yeah,
Oh,
you
let 'em-
say
let 'em- let 'em-
want them to have sex, right?
and sex is pleasurable, right? And people want that sort of pleasure.
Correct.
So when you say, would you advise your kids to engage in drugs? And I wouldn't advise them, but that's not my concern whether they do it or not. My concern is keeping them safe. So my kids,
telling them wear a condom.
exactly.
Don't
like
buy
that.
it off the street.
Exactly, bro.
Don't buy it off the street.
Exactly, because the most dangerous thing about drugs to most people who are black and brown is not the drugs, it's the police. And so that's why I would really tell people,
But
don't.
also, you don't know what's in it sometimes too.
but I tell my
because when
kids
you're
don't
buying
use
things
drugs.
and
Andrew,
you're
that's a
buying
great
pills off the
point,
street,
man.
You don't
That-
know what's in it.
But you tell your kids don't use drugs. Like I tell my kids don't use drugs. I'm not going to tell them go to the store where you know what's
Think
in
it
the
goes
drug.
after
I'm just
this.
saying don't use it at all.
People used to be like that about marijuana too. They used to be like, "Don't smoke weed; it's terrible." Now it's legal, and
But
people
I'm telling my
smoke
kids
it.
but
don't
that
use
ain't
marijuana
heroin.
either.
Can we come back to your point, please?
Yes, go. I'm sorry,
The
Dr.
point you made was, if what we don't know what's in these substances on the street.
We can move ahead to,
Says
here we
we're
go.
in an opioid.
We're a little different. We wrote a book, Outgrowing Addiction. And I had an earlier book, Addiction Proof Your Child, because we have a general approach to addiction, because we're thinking, well, you can get addicted to sex or love. There are people who kill themselves. You know, when you get to go to college, fall in love with somebody, they break up and they shoot themselves, which happens. So we have psychological resilience establishing mechanisms. Carl I've heard him speak about this. He'll say, well, give people solid information. Take good drugs, don't get bad drugs. We're psychologists or developmentalists, and we would say you need to allow your child to have an engagement, a positive engagement with life, which I'm sure Carl does in real life. You want them to have interest, you want them to have positive relationships, you want them to have positive values. And you and I would say, you want them to have independent experience. There's another new book out. It's, I don't know the title. It's a woman writing about, she took her small daughter, quite small, and went around the world seeing how people raise children. That's a bold book. And the bottom line was, it's incredible how fucked up we are as a society, because in 90% or more of the places that she went, child rearing wasn't as painful as it is for us. The kids were cooperative. They didn't fight. They contributed to the household. they were generous spirited. And in a way, it's because we have too much luxury. And as we say, it's a way because we're so afraid we don't allow kids, or we don't feel we can allow kids to experience life on their own. But the kids she exposes her own daughter to, they have to help out around the house, but often, in some cases, in a really basic way. Like in Nome, Alaska, or the family won't survive. She actually interacts with, people out in the wilderness. And we've lost an engagement with life and an ability to experience life directly on your own, to experience rewards and punishment, and to know what you have to do, which screws up the whole addiction equation. So we have a whole developmental model. His answer was kind of complex. Well, I wouldn't tell my kids to take drugs or take sex. I would, okay, we get your point. We would go beyond that. We say, well, we tell our kids, we have a positive goal with our kids to be able to interact positively with themselves, with the world, with other people. That's the best protection against addiction.
It's meta learning, like what we talked about last week. We would want our kids, maybe we wouldn't say, do have sex, don't have sex, do have drugs, don't have drugs. We would say, whatever you are experiencing, we want you to think about reasons why you're doing the things, what you're getting out of it, what are the risks involved in it, who is it affecting, how is it helping or affecting you, which is that.
And what are your alternatives, and you actually make them aware of addiction.
Yeah.
And of course, in the case of that, we're getting to a place where people have conversations like this around alcohol. I'm Jewish, and I was married to a Romanian woman. We introduced alcohol to our children when they were young, when they were teenagers. We're getting to a place where parents are going to have that kind of concept around marijuana when marijuana is legal everywhere. Mm-hmm. And in a way, you might say, well, you sort of have to have that concept. And we talk about it now, growing addiction. If you're giving your kids, Adderall, they have to have some concept of, what's this drug doing and why am I taking it?
Right.
And obviously, at some point, your kid's going to take a painkiller, and you'll probably give it to them, because they'll have some kind of medical emergency. So the ability to sort out what a drug is doing for you and how you respond to it, a kind of mindfulness, as you're describing, looking at life and what the options are. At one point, it's still on the internet, I think. I took Anna and we were interviewed by CNN. That was a good interview. And then they did a video interview, but then they did in my apartment with Anna. And Anna said, I'm at NYU and some of the kids there, they drink all weekend. My parents gave me alcohol when I wanted it when I was younger. It doesn't have that kind of impact for me. And then the last sentence in the interview, it's my favorite thing. I don't know why I didn't put it in the memoir. She said, my parents aren't spending all that money to send me to NYU for me to drink, which is another way of saying, I got a job here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make some place in life.
Yeah.
So Carl's he invites a lot of lightning. He's a lightning rod because he's so prominent. And he's the only African American to achieve tenure at Columbia University in a scientific field. The only one. Sort of like if Martin Luther King came out, or Ralph Bunche, or the guy who did all the research with peanuts, whatever his name was, and said, oh, well, I take heroin. It's sort of like, that's why I think these are African-American interviewers. They're going, oh my God, this guy's supposed to be a role model.
Yeah, right.
By the way, the woman, she was good.
Yeah.
Everything she said made sense. She said, well, you have to tell people about marijuana. It's legal or it's going to be legal. So they're going to have some like, well, okay, I can take it. How are you going to take it? She talked about, she said sugar. She talked about impurities. She was the one, she was the go-to person. But I see you got to the point where Carl got rankled are you going through withdrawal now? That was what the one guy said.
Yeah, right.
But at a later point, Charlemagne did say something. You saw
Yeah.
Carl speak in Burlington.
Yeah.
And on the panel, he said, well, I'll take heroin before they go to a tense meeting. I'll relax the night before. And Sally Satel said, you did what? Sally Satel, I've drunk wine with Sally Satel, but Sally Satel doesn't take marijuana, let alone heroin. Well, you shouldn't tell people that. And Carl's point is, well, how do people know that people can control drugs? If the people that control drugs, because they can control drugs, never tell anybody about it.
Yeah. Sally's answer was, Sally wrote a Wall Street Journal review of Carl's book, and a review was basically demonstrated in her response that day also, which was that I get what you're saying, just don't tell people that. They're going to get the wrong idea.
And Carl's whole book is, I mean, if there's one thing that he said on your show, well, people who use drugs sensibly have to reveal that. Not the reason we have all these myths, or one important reason we have all these myths, is because those people don't tell anybody.
Right.
So her review was essentially a recap of what she said then. But Charlemagne said to him, the guy said, are you going through withdrawal now? And Carl says, come on, man.
Yeah.
But Charlemagne said, when was the last time you took heroin? And Carl said, a year ago.
And I'll put that somewhere. I'll go back and I'll put that in somewhere.
And Charlemagne said, well, I had the impression, he wouldn't put it this way. If I take heroin once a year, okay, I'm not fine. It's like if you go to the hospital once a year, whatever they give you there, you're not addicted to it. He said something like, I thought you took it regularly. And based on that interchange with Sally, where he described, well, I go to a meeting. So in a way, Charlemagne, that was his best point of contact. Carl lost a little traction there. He's a heroin user. If you don't use a drug for a year, you're sort of a non-user.
Well, okay, but in his defense, I take your point and I agree with you. And I see why that was a sticking point right there, or it made it difficult to proceed in that conversation with his theory,
and it undercut his point of view.
His thing was when he's in different countries, he was splitting his time between Switzerland and New York, and so he was able to get chemically pure heroin in Switzerland, where he was using pretty regularly. And the answer to the question, well, when's the last time you used, is like, I don't know, a year ago. I can't. Who can get clean, pure heroin now during this pandemic? I can't. So right. I think that the two things. One, he can go maybe use it once. He'll use it when he has it. So he's not one of these guys that's taking drugs every single day, like maybe he's trying to portray himself as,
or even once a week. Yeah.
But he's also not probably a once a year guy. If he could get it more often and he knew that it was safe, he'd probably be using it much more frequently.
Now, the example I use, so the guy might say, I'm hypothesizing now, well, if you use it regularly, then you probably become addicted. Then I would turn to the woman and say, well, if you take sugar every day, do you become addicted? Or I would go back to what Carl said. If you have sex every day, do you become addicted? Because sex has a more direct impact on the pleasure centers of the brain. That was another thing you and I discussed about the interview. Carl said, well, sex can be dangerous too. You can get a STD. But I would answer that question. People get into all kinds of mayhem, self-destructive and otherwise, through sex and love.
Yeah.
The greatest, one of my lines is, the greatest source of murder and suicide is love. If love were a drug, it would be banned. Carl's not. Do you think Carl would say sex is addictive? I don't.
Yeah, I just don't think I think he thinks about things the same way. I don't think he makes a distinction between drugs or something like sex.
I disagree. Carl is a drug researcher. Every example he used he'll talk about meth, he'll talk about Adderall, he'll talk about heroin, he'll talk about fentanyl, he'll talk about alcohol. I believe that argument we had on the Addiction Theory Network, there's a group of people, it's a large group. There are people like you and I who think that the dangers of drugs are overdrawn, A, and B, they're misstated so that people aren't prepared well for dealing with drugs. That's where you and I and Carl are in the same bailiwick. As we've been saying, he doesn't have a larger vision of addiction, of how children avoid addiction. Or I think one of the things he was complaining about, and I know some of the people there say, well, if addiction's if used badly with regard to heroin and drugs, why would you expand the use of the term addiction to whole new areas like sex and love? That's going crazier, and gambling. Right. And what's our answer to that?
Well, I see what you're saying now. So I still stand by my point that I don't think he makes an incredible distinction between drugs and those things. I think it's more that he needs to respond to people's mythology around drugs. People aren't sending the same mythology all the time about sex. But you're right. It's like there's the idea that you're talking about, as someone might say, addiction's complicated enough. Why do you have to add more? And we're saying addiction is being made so complicated because we're excluding the rest of life from the theory or the idea about it.
It goes back to the original point. There aren't a pile of things that are addictive and a pile of things that aren't addictive, which Carl might go along with. That doesn't mean that but he knows, he says, well, heroin can be and alcohol can be addictive. And you and I would say, well, there's a bunch of powerful experiences. And those powerful gambling, something that can really absorb you, sex, love, you can imagine them. Some people get totally absorbed in shopping. Some people exercise. When you can get totally absorbed in something so that it rules your consciousness in a way that can allay all of your anxieties, be totally encompassing and predictable, that's a dangerous involvement.
And we would agree with him. He would agree probably with us that I think you could say all that and he would say, yeah, for sure, at this point in his career. And
I think he's moved along a little.
And that's important because it means that, well, whatever could be all encompassing like that, it means people do it to destruction because of some lack of belief that they can generate it somewhere else in their lives. They don't have balance in their lives. And that's why I think, but what you're saying, that's why it's important to understand all of that, to be, you put that up front rather than addiction remaining this strange concept that no one really defines, and you're kind of talking around each other about what it is.
Right. Because he never really, when I give a workshop, I'm going to say, well, this is what addiction is. I'll show a cycle of addiction. It's in our book.
Right.
Well, let's close with, we talk about children a lot. You have a small girl, a couple of years old. I have two adult daughters, one over 40 and one over 30, and an adult son. I sometimes wonder, people talk about bad things that happen to girls, women. I've never had those worries about my two daughters, let alone at this point in time, I think it's a fair statement. Well, given, what Governor Cuomo has been up to with like 25-year-old, they're not interns, they're full professionals, leaning on them. What if the young woman, they, had given in and had an affair with him? Where would that have ended up? He's 63. That would have been murder for her. Perhaps at this point in time, a lot of people are more worried about their daughters getting in a destructive sexual or love relationship, that one that was so unequal, and she would have been in love with him, or who knows, it wouldn't have come out well for her. And so I don't believe my daughters, I wouldn't say life has been totally smooth for them, but neither of them is going to be put upon. Neither of them is going to be destroyed or participate in a destructive relationship. I believe
they wouldn't put all their eggs in the basket of whatever that reward is, to the extent that they would allow themselves to be taken advantage of in some way. They would say, this is too much. I have other things I've got to do in life.
That's one thing. So they would be unlikely to be addictive. The thing is, they have good instincts about avoiding destructive things. They're aware of, they're mindful of when something's hurting them. So you would say, and I don't know if I said it, they had a mother, you know, if a relationship is harmful to you with drugs or alcohol or gambling or shopping or with another human being, well, that's not a place you want to be. So you have to be both care enough about yourself to know that you don't want to have negative things done to you, and be self-respecting enough that you won't let negative things be done to you. And you have to be mindful enough to have your sensors out. Like, I mean, I know I've had conversations with Anna where she'd say, well, that guy's just going in the wrong direction. She once went out with a guy who knew my book, Love and Addiction. He disliked it. She didn't break up with him because of that.
But she should have.
She said to me, Dad, I'm never going to get in a relationship with a recovering guy again. There's that was her bottom line there. So, all right, Carl's a famous, remarkable man. He's got a lot of guts. I mean, you might say, you know, well, we would ask the opposite question from Sally. Sally saying, why are you telling people this? Just keep it to yourself. And Carl is driven by an impulse that he knows these things aren't true about drugs. He knows the beliefs about drugs are harmful, especially to people in his community, or you know, the community he grew up in. And he feels intellectually needful. He has the intellectual integrity to say, I know this to be untrue and this to be true. I'm going to come out and say it. And, you know, I did talk to Carl about this. He had you can't fire the only African-American tenured scientist in the history of a university.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's got to be some repercussions out there, you know, in the board of directors or whatever there is at Columbia, you know, and I think you mentioned this, he's apprehensive about the kind of reactions he gets. Are you going to be a bad role model to your community when he goes on a radio show? So anybody who has that kind of guts to stand up, and he's got a lot, you know, he's got the most to lose.
Yeah.
When you're in a really strong position in life, you're in the most danger of having, and the guy said, well, what about your kids? So on the one hand, he's going to say, well, I want my kids, I don't tell my kids that they drugs, but if they take drugs, they should get healthy drugs. We would go farther and say, well, they should be healthful in general and mindful about anything they use. But the guy might have said, well, your kids are going to see you on television and they're going to say, oh, your father takes heroin. How do you feel about that? So that takes a certain amount of guts and understanding. Hopefully he has that kind of relationship with his children where they'll understand where he's coming from.
One thing I regret about speaking with him, maybe I will again sometime, is I asked him about that. I didn't realize all of his kids were grown, but I said, so what kinds of conversations do you have with your kids about drug taking? And I was I don't know him very well.
I think he has some younger kids.
She said they're all adults now.
They all are.
Even a 20-year-old, I think that's his youngest, but I don't know him well enough. I wanted to make sure in all of my questions that he knew I wasn't going to be asking one of those sneaky bullshit questions that he always gets. So he said, well, let me just be clear that my kids are past the drug experiment stage. And what was really on my mind, but I didn't say, was, well, tell me about that. So what does that mean? Why is there a distinction between the drug experiment stage and now that they're adults, there's not that anymore? Can you talk about that area?
Because you take drugs, which is what the guy said.
Right.
Well, Zach, he could tell, he knows where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And B, you have an ability not to put people back on their haunches.
I wanted to address that actually, because I think you get a bad rap for putting people back on their haunches. But what I've learned about you is that there's the kind of disagreeable where someone with some wacky theory who's killing people out there, okay, you can just say, hey, how's that working for you? That's one. But what you're doing here, and I think what you do with so many, you know, Sally Sattel, Mark Lewis, Maya Solovitz, people who are basically aligned with you. And I remember Johan saying to you, I hope this isn't too much to say, but I remember him saying,
go ahead,
well, how can you be so alienating or something with people who agree with you 99%? And I've come to learn, you've actually really taught me this. This is a very adult thing to do, to be disagreeable to the people who you want to be on your side and moving forward and doing well. I take that as a deep sign of respect. If you care enough to go into depth about what you might disagree with and what somebody else could do better. And that's what I think we're trying to do now.
And it's also a kind of, my greatest intellectual integrity is going to be shared with the people that I'm closest to.
Right.
I'm not going to misrepresent. When I was married for 30 years, I was married to a woman who had a strong outlook and agreement with mine. I mean, I guess I already knew this when we got together. I didn't do a quiz like, well, do you want children? What religious beliefs do you have? What's your finance? But we had the same attitude towards alcohol and drugs. I could never be involved in a relationship with somebody who is now and is the same. Well, she's married, but I don't have it in me to repress what I deeply believe in with people I care about and respect. I have to lay it out there and say, here.
So, with all respect and knowing that we admire you and love you and love what you're doing, Carl, that's what we want to say today. We watched this stupid interview where we had somebody we know has something so important to say, isn't able to say it, and partially because he's being kind enough not to just sort of torch them on their own show, but partly because maybe he hasn't developed the sort of broad framework and language to be able to just sort of, to lay it out there and then let them come to him now that he's, laid everything bare. So we'd like that. We'd like it if some people like Carl would talk a little bit more about what addiction means and why it's actually a meaningful concept, if you could get around to it.
We believe it's, that book behind you says outgrowing addiction. So addiction exists.
Mm.
You say, Carl, well, he did say people get addicted to heroin and alcohol. He got that far. Well, all right. So we kibitzed Carl. He's out there taking a lot of heat. I've taken a little heat in my lifetime. You've taken a little heat in your lifetime, in local venues. You're a friendly guy, but some people dislike your point of view.
And I expect you, this is something I said to you earlier, I'm going to do an interview. I won't say what it is, but I'm going to do an interview. And I was thinking, well, you did such a good job of getting to the bottom of what I was trying to think about with Carl. Will you do that with me? Next time I do an interview, when I'm missing the point or something, I would like your response to that. So,
well, all right, I'll be happy to give it.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'm aware that you were on your county council. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
You've been in many situations. Well, you don't look for arguments,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't say things. You don't say things that aren't true, that you don't believe. And we might name a couple of at least one addiction theorist who does say things that those aren't true. But B, you really won't sit quietly if you're involved in something with kids or with drugs, and people lay something out on the table. Well, there's too many prescription drugs. That's why these kids out here are taking it. You're not gonna keep silent. You're not. Sally Satel could have the same complaint about you. Why didn't you just keep quiet? You don't have to talk about that.
Yeah.
And you're not a disagreeable. Well, you say it. I'm not a disagreeable person, but I will disagree. So that's all right. Let's float this out there, and maybe Carl will hear about it.
All right. Happy Sunday, everybody. And Stanton, thank you so much for doing this with me.
Pleasure.